For years, the outside world believed Ray Whittaker's life was defined by one simple fact. He lived at the end of a dirt road, in a house forgotten by time, surrounded by relatives who said they were doing the best they could. That was the public story, or at least, the one most people accepted because it was the only version they had ever been shown. But the deeper investigators looked into Ray's life, the clearer it became that the version of care he received inside that collapsing home bore almost no resemblance to real protection. It was a patchwork of good intentions, broken systems, overwhelming need, and, most painfully, shocking truths that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. People often ask how a man could reach his 70s without ever truly speaking, without medical documentation, without structured care, without even a clear safety record. What they fail to realize is that Ray's entire life unfolded behind closed doors in a place where silence was easier than intervention, where poverty was normalized, and where disability blended into the background of everyday survival. The tragedy is not that the world failed him at the end. The tragedy is that the world didn't even know he existed until it was too late. The first truth begins where every truth about Ray must begin, inside his mind. Those who met him described him as sweet, frightened, childlike, and reactive. But childlike barely scratches the surface. Ray's cognition never developed beyond early childhood. His emotions, startle responses, fear, confusion, were the same as a small boy's, yet the body containing those emotions aged into its 70s. Anyone who understands severe developmental disability knows how dangerous that mismatch can be. A child who runs away when startled can be caught, comforted, guided. A 72-year-old man with the same response? That becomes a life-threatening situation. Ray had no language to advocate for himself. He had no means to express discomfort beyond grunts, bark-like vocalizations, and distressed movements. He could not read. He could not write. He could not call 911. He could not explain a bruise, a fear, or an injury. And because he could not articulate anything, the burden fell entirely on whoever lived with him to interpret his needs correctly. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes, the signs of distress were lost entirely inside the daily chaos of a home stretched far beyond its limits. But even that truth is only the beginning. The second shocking truth was the environment itself. The home where Ray spent almost his entire life was described, by multiple independent visitors, as a decaying structure filled with hazards. Floors soft from rot. Windows cracked or missing. The smell of gasoline lingering from a stove with malfunctioning burners. Food left out long enough for flies to settle into it. A cluttered kitchen where spoiled meat sat unthrown, where insects crawled freely. A property surrounded by broken vehicles, rusted metal, and leaning structures one strong wind away from collapse. Even the bathroom, a basic dignity most adults take for granted, was an outhouse behind the house, weather-worn and barely functional. People asked why the family lived this way. The answer is tragically simple. They had always lived that way. Decay becomes its own kind of normal when there is no money, no education, and no support. But normalization doesn't erase danger, and for someone with Ray's cognitive limitations, danger wasn't just possible. It was constant. He couldn't smell a gas leak and understand its meaning. He couldn't identify mold as a health threat. He couldn't distinguish clutter from hazards. He couldn't understand why dirty dishes or spoiled food might make him sick. He couldn't protect himself from a house that was slowly collapsing around him. The walls didn't just surround him, they failed him just as much as the systems meant to help him did. The third truth cuts even deeper. Ray lived in profound isolation. While documentary crews and content creators later turned the Whittaker home into a viral curiosity, almost no one visited that house before cameras arrived. The family's remote location meant that Ray's world was reduced to a handful of people: Betty, Larry, and occasionally other relatives. That was his entire social universe. No therapists, no home health aides, no disability specialists, no structured programs, no consistent medical oversight. Just the same faces, the same patterns, the same silences. Isolation, for someone like Ray, acts like a second disability layered on top of the first. Without exposure to new environments, language models, or communication tools, he had no path toward improvement. Without routine medical evaluations, early signs of decline went unnoticed. Without the presence of mandated reporters, subtle neglect could continue for decades unnoticed. Isolation ensured that whatever happened inside that home, good or bad, remained invisible to the outside world. Yet the fourth truth is the most disturbing. No one with authority monitored Ray for most of his life. Adult Protective Services had no long-term record of him. There was no assigned guardian. No documented periodic welfare checks. No enforcement of living standards. Nothing. His welfare depended entirely on two elderly relatives who, whether they loved him or not, were not capable of providing the level of care he desperately needed. This was not a failure of the family alone. It was a systemic collapse. Only after the family became a viral subject of online fascination did state agencies finally step in. Millions of strangers saw Ray online before a single official ever intervened. That reality speaks volumes about where our society places its attention and where it withholds it. But the fifth truth compounds that neglect, corruption, and manipulation began creeping into the home long before the state arrived. When donations flowed into the family following viral exposure, the sudden influx of money became both a lifeline and a trap. People close to the family misused funds. Some stole. Some fabricated stories, false death announcements, exaggerated medical claims, to solicit more money. Donations intended to improve Ray's life were diverted, mismanaged, or simply disappeared. And each time trust broke down, support dwindled further. Ray had no idea why strangers sent money. He had no idea why the money disappeared. He only understood the consequences, the repairs that never happened, the food shortages. Then comes the sixth truth, the one often whispered but rarely addressed openly: addiction in the home. Even when individuals struggling with substance use care deeply about family, addiction creates instability that ripples through every corner of a household. Erratic routines, missing funds, emotional volatility, confusion. For someone like Ray, who depends entirely on predictable structure and stable support, that instability becomes a form of harm, even if unintentional. But nothing is as devastating as the seventh truth. When Ray was finally removed from the home for his safety, he also lost the only emotional world he had ever known. His caregivers may have failed him at times, but they were also his constants. His familiarity, his comfort, his entire sense of belonging. The state rescued his body, but in doing so severed the fragile emotional bonds he depended on. Confidentiality laws mean his family does not know where he is. They may never see him again. And Ray, unable to understand legal processes or long-term institutional care, experienced his removal not as protection but as displacement. That final truth reframes everything. Ray's tragedy is not about one bad event or one bad actor. It is the accumulated result of 7 decades of poverty, disability, isolation, systemic oversight failures, family strain, exploitation, and emotional dislocation. His suffering was not sudden. It was slow, quiet, and constant. When people first saw Ray online, many assumed his life with Larry and Betty was simply unusual, maybe unconventional, maybe even eccentric, but harmless. The viral clips painted a picture of an odd but somehow endearing family tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. What the world didn't see was what lay just outside the camera frame. The exhaustion, the environmental decay, the unsupervised risks, and the daily struggles that shaped Ray's existence in ways that were both heartbreaking and unavoidable. To understand Ray's suffering, you have to step beyond the simplified narrative that internet fame created. His story wasn't just about poverty. It wasn't just about disability. It wasn't just about neglect or family dysfunction. It was about the slow collapse of a caregiving system built on fragile shoulders. Shoulders that could no longer carry the weight long before anyone realized how heavy it truly was. The truth is that Larry and Betty were not villains in the traditional sense. They did not set out to harm Ray. In their minds, they were doing exactly what they had done for decades, surviving. But survival is not the same as proper care, and love, however genuine, cannot replace the professional structure needed to keep someone like Ray safe. And that distinction becomes painfully apparent when you examine the cracks that widened under them year after year. The first of those cracks was the age and health of Ray's caregivers. Both Larry and Betty were elders themselves. Both faced physical limitations, chronic pain, medical needs, and the daily fatigue of living in poverty. Caring for one vulnerable adult is a monumental task. Caring for three, Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, was an impossible one. There were days Larry struggled to stand upright without steadying himself. There were days Betty's breathing was so labored that even small tasks left her winded. Yet every day, they were expected to lift, feed, clean, supervise, and protect adults who required constant attention. The world tends to underestimate what caregiving truly demands. It isn't just cooking meals or providing a place to sleep. It involves monitoring behavioral changes, recognizing medical issues early, ensuring hygiene standards, preventing accidents, preventing wandering, preparing balanced meals, documenting medications, maintaining the household environment, and responding calmly to panic, confusion, and distress. Most trained aides work in shifts for a reason. Burnout is inevitable. But burnout in that isolated home had no outlet. There were no relievers, no visiting nurses, no caseworkers consistently checking in, no counseling, no support groups, no agency oversight, no respite care. Larry and Betty aged, but Ray did not become any easier to manage. His cognitive delays were permanent, his reactions unpredictable, his dependence total. The burden grew, even as their capacity to carry it shrank. Where, then, was the support system? That question leads directly to the second crack, the complete absence of professional oversight. For decades, the family operated informally, without guidance or intervention. While some people assumed that social workers checked on them regularly, the truth is far more disturbing. They didn't. Investigators later confirmed that Ray had no consistent welfare checks, no case file that followed him from year to year, no record of medical evaluations conducted by state agencies. He simply existed outside the system, invisible until the internet forced him into view. That invisibility is not rare in remote Appalachian communities, where poverty and disability often exist unnoticed. Many families slip through bureaucratic gaps, especially when adult children with disabilities are never enrolled in formal programs. Without documentation, they are not assigned case managers. Without case managers, there are no visits. Without visits, there is no accountability. Ray's life was never evaluated by professionals because no official mechanism had ever been established to ensure he received the care he needed. Some would argue that family is supposed to fill that gap. But family itself was the source of the third major crack: instability caused by stress, conflict, and outside interference. As cameras arrived, money appeared, strangers visited, and opportunistic individuals saw the Whittakers as an easy way to gain attention or profit. Suddenly, the household became ground zero for manipulation. Donations flowed in, promises were made, and expectations soared about improving the home. But with money came turmoil. Argument replaced cooperation. Distrust replaced unity. Misused funds replaced transparent budgeting. Individuals outside the home inserted themselves into decision-making roles they had no training or authority for. And all of this noise, financial tension, outsiders stirring conflict, sudden emotional explosions, created the exact. Ray needed quiet. He needed routine. He needed simple days built on stability. Instead, the home became a revolving door of content creators, visitors, arguments, and worries about money and exposure. The fourth crack was the environment itself. The house had always been modest, but modest eventually became unsafe. Floors sagged under weight. Wiring was outdated. Drafts seeped in through cracks in the walls. Temperatures fluctuated wildly depending on the season. Clean water was inconsistent. Mold crept along corners. Food storage was unreliable. With the outhouse deteriorating, hygiene became a daily struggle. Maintaining basic sanitation was a constant challenge. For Ray, these environmental hazards weren't inconveniences, they were threats he couldn't recognize. A leaking gas burner is a danger to any adult. For someone unable to understand cause and effect, unable to express symptoms of dizziness or nausea, that danger becomes exponentially worse. The fifth crack was emotional neglect, not from malice, but from exhaustion. Caregivers who are drowning cannot always provide emotional warmth. Ray needed reassurance, consistent interaction, and gentle redirection. But with two overwhelmed, elderly caregivers juggling 3 dependent adults, emotional care often fell to the bottom of the list. Not because they didn't love him, but because survival took priority. And emotional deprivation is a form of suffering that rarely gets documented, yet always leaves a mark. The sixth crack came from the ripple effects of addiction and manipulation introduced into the home by external actors. BJ's admitted drug use, her manipulations of donation funds, her fabricated stories, and her volatile presence created a shadow that stretched across the entire household. Every instance of chaos, every moment of stress, every overnight argument or emotional blowout affected Ray. People sometimes ask whether Ray understood addiction. Of course he didn't. But he understood fear. He understood tension in the room. He understood when someone screamed or slammed a door. Stress doesn't require comprehension to leave a scar. The seventh crack, the one everything eventually collapsed under, was that the family simply could not protect him anymore. Not from environmental hazards. Not from predators online. Not from external manipulators. Not from their own exhaustion. Not even from their own aging bodies. The term failure to protect does not mean they didn't love Ray. It means they loved him more than they were capable of safely caring for him. It means the burden was bigger than their strength. It means the home was beyond repair long before anyone admitted it. When investigators finally stepped back and evaluated the situation, it wasn't one incident that made the decision for them. It was all the cracks combined: structural, emotional, financial, environmental, medical, and systemic. When added together, they formed a picture of a vulnerable man whose life had become a continuous struggle for safety in a place where safety was no longer possible. And that is where Ray's story shifts from hidden suffering to intervention. Comment below. Do you think Ray's removal was inevitable, or could proper support have saved the household before it collapsed? Long before the state arrived with paperwork, long before the world debated whether Larry and Betty were villains or victims, the warning signs were already there, quiet, incremental, and accumulating like weight on an already cracked foundation. Nothing about what happened to Ray was sudden. It was the result of a slow unraveling, a gradual collapse of a household that had been stretched to its limit for too many years. To understand why the state finally intervened, you have to understand one crucial truth. The Whittaker home didn't fail in one spectacular moment. It failed in dozens of small ones. Tiny fractures that deepened over time until the structure, the family, and the caregiving system simply couldn't carry the strain anymore. The moment the state stepped in was not a single event. It was the inevitable conclusion of problems that had gone unaddressed for decades. Everything began to fall apart the moment outside attention collided with internal instability. When the Whittaker family became a global spectacle, the home, once hidden and isolated, found itself under a microscope. Suddenly people who had never heard of Odd, West Virginia were studying every detail of Ray's life, every frame of every video. Some offered compassion. Others offered criticism. A few offered money. And many offered opinions that they were in no position to give. The viral exposure was a double-edged sword. It brought attention to Ray's conditions, attention he desperately needed. But it also brought opportunists, manipulative figures, and people hungry for influence. Suddenly, the family home became a battleground of intentions, some good, some questionable, some outright harmful. This leads directly into the first major factor that forced state intervention: exploitation from the outside. Opportunists saw the family's vulnerability as a stage for their own agendas. Donations poured in, promises were made, and outsiders inserted themselves into the family system under the guise of help. But help is only help when it provides stability, and stability was the last thing the Whittaker household received. Instead, the family became entangled in financial mismanagement, emotional manipulation, public drama, and escalating tension. The individuals who stepped into the home did not have training, oversight, or accountability. They were not required to act in Ray's best interest. They were not bound by ethical standards. Some were motivated by money, others by fame, and others by a twisted sense of self-importance. What they left behind was confusion and instability. Behind closed doors, this chaos manifested in ways Ray could feel but could never articulate. Raised voices, tension thick enough to taste, sudden arrivals, sudden departures. The household environment became unstable, unpredictable, and emotionally volatile. For someone like Ray, nonverbal, cognitively impaired, sensitive to emotional shifts, this was devastating. The state does not intervene because a house is messy or because a family is poor. Poverty is not neglect. Rural living is not abuse. But when that poverty mixes with manipulation, exploitation, and unmanaged disability, it wasn't just about clutter. It wasn't just about an old home. It was about structural danger, real hazards that put the lives of 3 vulnerable adults at risk daily. Investigators documented decaying floors, compromised wiring, fluctuating temperatures, insufficient sanitation, spoiled food, potential mold, and areas of the home that posed immediate physical risks. Most adults can mitigate these dangers. But Ray could not. He couldn't avoid hazards he didn't understand. He couldn't report something was wrong. He couldn't retreat to a safe space. The conditions didn't just make life difficult, they made it unsafe. Even worse, repairs that could have been made with donation money weren't done. Not consistently. Not to the extent needed. Instead, money vanished, misused by people who claimed to be helping. This brings us to the third major factor: the failure of donation oversight and the infiltration of addiction into the caregiving ecosystem. BJ's actions, misusing funds, fabricating stories, exploiting the public sympathy, revealed a household already consumed by instability. Addiction is not a private issue inside a caregiving environment. It spreads. It destabilizes. It redirects money that was meant for survival. It influences judgment. It brings unpredictability into a home that requires calm and consistency. Every dollar diverted was a missed meal, a missed repair, a missed opportunity to give Ray the structure he needed. Every day spent in chaos because of addiction was a day Ray spent emotionally unprotected. Addiction does not need to belong to a caregiver to affect the care. It affects the environment. It affects trust. It affects the flow of resources. And every ripple lands hardest on the most vulnerable people in the home. The fourth factor was the sheer burden crushing Larry and Betty. They were elderly, overwhelmed, and in survival mode. Their own health was deteriorating. Their stamina was depleted. Their coping mechanisms were failing. They were drowning, trying to hold up 3 adults who required daily, intensive support. Caregiving burnout is not a personality flaw. It is a biological response to long-term stress. It changes neurochemistry. It affects memory, patience, emotional regulation, and physical health. Overwhelmed caregivers make mistakes. They overlook warning signs. They forget tasks. They lose their ability to enforce structure. The state saw this and understood something the public often ignores. Love is not enough. Love cannot prevent accidents. Love cannot correct medical neglect. Love cannot substitute for trained caregivers when the needs exceed the caregiver's capacity. The fifth factor was the presence of violence and threats within the household ecosystem. Several accounts documented dangerous encounters involving BJ and her boyfriend, including allegations that Timmy was physically assaulted. Whether every detail was true or not, the state had enough consistent reporting to consider the environment unsafe. Even if Larry and Betty never personally harmed Ray, they failed to shield him from individuals who posed a threat. Failure to protect is not about intent, it's about ability. And by this point, the household had lost the ability to safeguard its most vulnerable members. The sixth factor was the complete lack of communication ability on Ray's part. He could not speak. He could not explain pain. He could not describe abuse. He could not tell anyone that he was cold, hungry, afraid, or sick. Nonverbal individuals rely entirely on the awareness of their caregivers, and when those caregivers are exhausted, overwhelmed, stressed, and embroiled in external conflict, they miss things. Not intentionally, but inevitably. The state recognized that Ray was a man living in silence with no ability to advocate for himself. When someone cannot communicate suffering, the law must step in if the signs around them show that suffering is likely. The seventh and final factor, the one that broke whatever lingering hesitation existed, was the realization that the environment would never improve. Not with donations. Not with outside helpers. Not with continued internet attention. Not with the same structures in place. The problems were systemic, not situational. The state concluded that Ray was not simply living in poverty, he was living in an unmanageable, unsafe ecosystem that no amount of goodwill could repair. So they acted. Some people cried governmental overreach. Others said it was too late. But the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The intervention was both overdue and inevitable. Removing Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy was not about punishing Larry and Betty. It was about ensuring that individuals who had spent decades trapped in silence, chaos, and environmental danger finally received medical supervision, reliable meals, personal hygiene, structured routines, and professional oversight. The home didn't collapse in a single day. It collapsed piece by piece, crack by crack, until the state had no ethical choice but to intervene. Comment below. Do you believe the intervention actually protected Ray? Or do you think there was another solution the state never considered? When Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy were taken from the collapsing Whittaker home, it wasn't a quiet process. It was abrupt, jarring, and emotionally devastating for the family left behind. Larry and Betty stood outside, trying to make sense of what the state workers were saying. They had spent their entire lives doing the only thing they knew, holding the family together with whatever energy and resources they had left. And now the state was telling them that everything they had done was not enough. To many viewers online, the removal felt cruel, heartless, cold. But when you examine the 7 shocking truths behind Ray's life inside that home, the decision becomes far more complicated and far more necessary than anyone initially realized. The final truth is this: Ray was not just living in the wrong environment. He was living in a place where his suffering was invisible, unreported, misunderstood, and unaddressed. What the state provided wasn't a reward, a punishment, or a political move. It was a last resort to protect individuals who could no longer be protected by the people who loved them most. The moment Ray entered state care, his world changed dramatically. For the first time in more than 70 years, he was in an environment shaped not by chaos, exhaustion, and poverty, but by structure. Clean floors, predictable meals, a bed without rotting boards beneath it, temperature control, trained caregivers, medical oversight. A locked facility where people like BJ's boyfriend could never simply walk through the door again. One of the deepest tragedies of Ray's story is that he never knew these things were missing. He didn't know what he should have had. He didn't know he was supposed to feel safe. He didn't know he was supposed to have a functioning bathroom, a clean kitchen, or caregivers who weren't drowning under impossible burdens. He lived with whatever he was given, and because he could not speak, he endured conditions silently, conditions most adults wouldn't tolerate for a week. In state care, his silence no longer hides him. It protects him. But there is another side to this new reality, one the public rarely considers. When Ray was removed from the home, he didn't just lose the environment that failed him. He also lost the only emotional world he recognized. The faces he saw every morning, the hands that brought him food, the rhythms of the household he had spent a lifetime learning. To him, it wasn't a broken home, it was the only home. State custody gave him safety, but it also took something irreplaceable, the comfort of familiarity. This truth sits at the center of everything. Ray's rescue came with a cost. The state saved his physical well-being, but the emotional rupture is undeniable. Lorraine lost the son she always watched over. Timmy lost the only home he ever understood. Betty and Larry lost the people they cared for every day, even if they could no longer meet the standards caregivers are legally required to uphold. Cases like this do not come with perfect solutions. There is only the least harmful one. Some people ask whether Ray could have been helped without being removed, whether donations, renovations, or outside intervention could have rebuilt the home, restored order, and positioned Larry and Betty as stable caregivers once again. But the truth is that the problems weren't structural. They were systemic, emotional, behavioral, generational. The environment didn't fail because it was old. It failed because it could not support the level of vulnerability inside it. You cannot repair a home when the foundation itself is cracked. The state knew what most online viewers refused to accept. Placing Ray back into that environment would have been neglect by the system itself. Even the best-intentioned relatives cannot meet the needs of profoundly disabled adults without training, support, and stability. And the Whittaker home, no matter how much love existed inside it, could not provide that. So the state chose the option that offered Ray the highest chance of physical safety, medical care, longevity, and supervision. Not perfection, but protection. Where Ray is today remains unknown to the public. Confidentiality laws prevent disclosure. All that is known is that he is somewhere cleaner, somewhere safer, somewhere structured. The emotional void may remain, but the daily dangers do not. The final question is the one that lingers. Was this justice or tragedy? Saving or severing? Protection or punishment? The truth is uncomfortable but unavoidable. It was all of these things at once. Ray's story ends not with a reunion or a restoration, but with a reality that millions of vulnerable adults face every